Hey everyone, this is Caro, your host for the Shuffle Dating podcast, and we are here with a new guest, Eliana. Hey, how are you?
Hi, nice to be here. How are you?
I'm okay. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast. We are really happy to have you. We are talking today about interactions and relationships, how they affect them. Would you like to introduce a little bit about yourself to the public?
Sure. So I am currently a principal researcher at the Booth School of Business in their behavioral science department. I got my PhD in management and organizations at the Kellogg School of Management, and I'm really interested in studying sort of people's beliefs and how those impact their decisions. And right now, my research focuses largely on people's beliefs about conversations and about what kinds of conversations lead to lasting social connections. So I study things like how likely people are to engage in a conversation, what their expectations are, and what those conversations actually end up being like.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. I did study economics at uni, so I know a little bit
Cool.
about expectations and how important they are. So I know you have like a huge background on research and business, but I think a little bit that goes with shuffle is about how important is that those 10 minutes of conversation or those 10 minutes of interaction with the person be worth it. So what is your insight about it?
Yeah, so in my research, I actually run experiments that pretty much replicate the speed dating type context. So we put people in a room together, they don't know each other, and we ask them to have a conversation. What I'm really interested in right now is like what types of conversations lead for people to actually have like a fun, interesting conversation that leads to meaningful social connection. And there's a ton of research that finds that when you have deeper conversations, people tend to both enjoy the conversation more and tend to feel more bonded to their conversation partner. That tends to lead to lasting social connection. But what's really interesting is in our research, we find that people are really hesitant to have those conversations, even though they want to. So people think that it's going to be too awkward to disclose something personal about themselves, or they might feel rejected if they ask a deeper question that somebody else doesn't want to answer.
Mhm.
And that really seems to be like an expectation problem because people really love having these conversations. People love sort of talking about their backgrounds and their sort of what's meaningful to them. But people are just afraid to, offer that up or ask. So what I think is really like the useful insight for Shuffle is that, anything that can sort of prompt people to have those deeper conversations, anything that sort of makes them feel more comfortable sharing or asking will tend to lead to a more meaningful conversation. And what we study in our research as well is the sort of consequences of staying too shallow. So when people ask like more shallow, less meaningful questions, even though those feel more comfortable, people tend to get pretty bored and they tend to leave the conversation faster than they do when they're having a deep conversation.
Yeah, so when we're talking about shallow conversations, it's about the weather or like those kind of topics, right? But
Yeah.
I do think that also is a bit cultural. Like, I don't know, there are some taboo topics in American culture that might not be taboo topics in Latin American culture. So how do you how do you know what to ask, or which topics do you know that it's okay to touch them, especially in a first time basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is actually research going on in our lab that essentially tries to replicate these findings in other cultures, and they replicate pretty broadly. And that's just this idea that people want to be having deeper conversations than they are having. And that there's this expectation barrier between how like awkward they think that type of a deep conversation is going to be and how awkward it actually is, which is really not that awkward. In terms of specific topics, I think your point is totally right, that you do need some nuance when you're thinking about, what's something that's culturally acceptable to ask versus not. Also, the definition of a deep topic will vary. So, for example, I'm Greek, and so Greeks are like, we love to share, and I think what would be considered a deep topic in American culture would be considered just normal conversation in Greek culture. So I think the threshold for what is deep talk can totally vary by and then of course you need some awareness of the cultural norms and the cultural environment, and getting sort of too personal in a way that's intrusive or offensive is definitely not the way to go. It needs sort of some understanding of, we are in this specific speed dating context. People are here to make connections. People are here to have conversations. So I want to have a conversation that's deep and interesting and meaningful, but without crossing any sort of cultural boundary.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I think Greek culture is a little bit more similar to Latin American culture in that sense. Like, we like to share. So our topics of deep conversation will be more aligned than what Americans or maybe Germans or Scandinavian people will share. But what about people? Okay, so people will go to a shuffle event or a dating speed event, and they will actually have a deep conversation, but they wouldn't match. And then people will say like, "Oh, I shared too much," or like, "I it was because I was too straightforward." What will happen then? Probably was not because they were too straightforward or they shared too much. What will you think then?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think there is something of a dance that happens in a conversation. It's like there's a sort of back and forth that happens, that makes conversation feel good when there is conversational chemistry. What we find in our research is that starting with a super deep question, like kind of out of nowhere, people don't like that. People are sort of pretty averse to going from nothing to super deep, unless they're specifically instructed to, which then again, you kind of remove some of the like, oh, this is sort of weird because you've been giving the instruction to go deep. So I think one sort of nugget from that is, if you do want people to have deep conversations, make it the norm, make it sort of like this is part of the exercise type thing. But so people tend to want to build up to deep conversation. Now, what our research finds is that if you take too long to build up to that deeper conversation, if you spend too much time in the shallow end, then you're going to lose interest pretty quickly. But if you go sort of out of nowhere straight into deep conversation, that's going to sort of make, you haven't done the dance to get to that point. So what could be happening is people who feel like they share too much might not be sort of building up enough. But I also think that, one of the sort of biggest findings in psychology is that we are sort of really good at protecting our self-esteem and our egos. And so a lot of times it's more difficult for us to believe that we don't have chemistry for someone than it is to believe that maybe we did something wrong that we can correct in the future. So it could also be that there just wasn't a chemistry with that person, and unless they did go too deep too quickly, rather than dwell on that, you might just move on to another person where you would have more chemistry. What we do find in our research, which is really cool, is that you can sort of bring any random two people into a conversation, and they'll typically have a good, enjoyable conversation. They'll typically form a connection. But the recipe for that is giving them license to ask deeper questions and sort of keeping them in that conversation for like 10, 20 minutes or something, because people are much more likely to sort of invest and try to come up with like deeper, interesting questions if they know that they're in it for 10 minutes.
Okay. So right now in Shuffle, our dates last between 8 to 10 minutes. So the events don't last that long as well because normally they meet around 7 to 9 people. However, there are people who feel that if a conversation doesn't go along in the first 1 2 minutes, they are just like, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. Um, is there any way that that conversation can be salvaged, or if you feel it in your gut that it's not going anywhere, it's better just to leave the conversation?
So I think there's a couple different dimensions here. So one, there is the extreme, right? There are sort of people that you, for whatever reason, instantly know that you don't align in some value or you disagree with on some fundamental level, and that conversation, that's not someone that you want to connect with, and that's, you know, that happens. I don't think that that's going to be the norm in a setting like this, just because you have people who are opting in to this particular event, so they're likely to share some similarities, but it could happen. So in those cases, no, I don't think that there's really anything that you can do to save that. It's just you know that there's some fundamental incompatibility. And I guess psychologists would claim that there are sort of conversational things that you can do, but in a dating context, I don't really think you're going to start dating someone that you disagree with that much. Now, for like everything in between. So we find in our research that you can form a social connection with most people if you're asking the right questions, if you're going deep enough. That doesn't mean you're going to have a romantic connection with everybody based on the conversation, because there's other sort of elements that go into play. There's like attraction and stuff like that. So, but I think that, encouraging people who come to these events to try to keep an open mind about forming any social connection, and just trying to have a good conversation for 8 or 10 minutes. I think that most of the time people are going to have those good conversations. They may not, feel romantically interested or connected with that person, but you're probably still going to have a good conversation. And so, but you need to give it that fixed amount of time, because if you just move on too quickly, you might lose connections that you could have had.
That's true. Keeping an open mind is always important when you meet someone. Sometimes the first impression is not what it seems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like, we think that that's the problem with talk that's too shallow. So like, if you start with the weather, that's already going to sort of put people in this like, oh, this is boring, like this isn't really what I want to be talking about. But or if you start with something like, how was your day, without really knowing each other, you're not going to sort of share the meaningful parts of your day. So it's really about finding like an initial question that's fun and creative and interesting and allows people to get into more like personal territory and like disclose something about themselves.
So, coming from that one, what would you say is a good first question? Like, as you say, like, how was your day? It's too personal. What will be a good question? A good first question?
So broadly, I would say it's really anything that somebody has to respond to with something personal. So right off the top of my head, you might ask, tell me about a recent trip that you went on. Where did you go? Why did you go there? Who did you go with? And that you're not going to get the same answer from everybody. You're going to learn about that person. You're going to learn, like, do they travel alone? Do they travel with their friends? Do they travel with their family? What type of vacation do they like to go on? So you can ask something like that. You can even say something like, what was the best meal you had recently? Anything that sort of gets people to talk about themselves. Like, the weather is such a sort of it's become kind of like a cliche for this boring conversation because it's really not personal to like to you. It's what's happening outside. Now, people who are really good conversationalists can make the weather sort of self-relevant. Like you might make a funny joke about how like the weather impacted you in a particular way. So it's not that like that couldn't happen, but I think the most successful conversations happen when the first person who asks a question is opening a doorway and making it as easy as possible for them to learn something personal about the other person.
Mhm. Um, what will you think? What will you say is the best way to become a good conversationalist? Because I think a lot of us have lost that ability after COVID. Like we were too many years in house or working from home, so social skills are out of the window.
Definitely. And it takes a different kind of skill set to be a good, have a good conversation with a close friend or a family member, someone that you already feel comfortable with versus starting a new conversation with a stranger. And I also think that the in-person dynamic is very different than the online dynamic, which is why, that this feels like sort of Shuffle's like biggest strength is you're moving conversation from an app to in person. But there is actually a ton of research on what makes someone a good conversationalist, and it's remarkably that you ask questions. So we find in our research that people, when you give people a list of sort of more deep questions, and you ask people, to what extent do you want to ask these questions to a stranger? And they'll rate that pretty low because they'll say it feels awkward to ask these questions. I don't want them to think that I'm sort of imposing on them. But when you ask them, how much do you want to answer these questions? People rate that super highly. People want to talk about themselves and they want to talk about what's important to them and what's interesting to them and about their life story. Like, as humans, we love narrations. We love stories. We love to sort of package our life history into like this interesting story. So people want to tell that. So a really good conversationalist, someone who's really good at interacting with new people, is someone who's going to ask questions in a thoughtful way. They're going to be sort of aware of, what's a question that's a good gateway into a more personal conversation without sort of coming out of nowhere with a super deep question. And they're going to, ask questions that they know are going to be personal, that they feel like they can sort of add on to, like conversation is a dance. So, you want to ask a question that somebody will respond to that then you can bounce off of. And, listening, like such a big part of being a good conversationalist is listening in an active way and asking questions, feeling like for the other person, it's feeling like you're understood. So when someone's actively listening, you really feel that they're taking an interest in you. And ultimately, I think that's more important than the conversation topics themselves, because the people who are going to ask these thoughtful questions are going to lead them in a direction that's personal. But what the specific question is doesn't really matter because you're creating a feeling. You're creating like, I want to feel like this person is interested in getting to know me. So if they're asking me questions that I can sort of talk about in terms of my life and disclose something personal, that makes me feel like I'm being understood.
Mm-hmm. So the goal of the conversation, of the goal of that small talk, is to feel understood, to feel heard. That that will be like a little summary, right?
Well, I wouldn't say of the small talk. I would say of the whole conversation. If you
Mhm.
want, basically, if you want to have a good conversation with someone, you want to make them feel like you're interested in them.
Okay.
And the best way to do that is to ask questions that allow people to answer in a personal way, that allow
Mhm.
them to get, a little deeper with every sort of statement.
Mhm.
And you can easily see how asking like, like, oh, what do you think of the weather today? Doesn't really get at that. I don't feel like you're taking an interest in me as a person. But if you say something like, tell me about the best meal you had recently, I will then go into a story about, this one restaurant I went to and I really like sandwiches and I had this one sandwich and, I went with my friend, and it's just so easy for that to snowball into more deep conversation that then the other person can also be like, oh, I also love sandwiches. Like my favorite sandwich is this place. So I would say a summary is a good conversationalist is someone who asks questions that open a door to self-disclosure and more personal information. And that will help the person you're talking to feel understood.
That sounds amazing. Like this morning, I was talking about questions with my boss. So this is just like
Mm.
goal to hear this episode today.
Oh,
I
I'm
would
so
like to know
glad.
more about
Yeah.
you because how did you get into this research though? Like how did you get into asking questions?
It's been a long journey. I've always been interested in psychology and human behavior. I studied psychology in college. And then I worked for a few years in sort of more marketing type roles. And then I got my PhD, which was a period for me to discover what was really interesting to me about the whole human behavior space. And to me, that was people's beliefs. We have a tendency to think that people evaluate options in this rational way, and people have accurate understandings of what the outcome of a certain behavior is going to be, and that's really not so true. We find in
Mhm.
psychology that people are relying on their beliefs, and their beliefs can be miscalibrated. They're not necessarily accurate representation of what happens in the world. So during my PhD, I got involved in studying people's beliefs. My work there focused more on how people select different types of work and how people think about motivation at work. But I really love relationship psychology. That's, thinking about relationships and talking about relationships like has always been a passion of mine. So in the last year or so, I've been focusing pretty much primarily on people's beliefs around forming connections with other people, because that's sort of the beginning part of any relationship. And so I work with Nicholas Epley at the Booth School of Business, and he's an expert on human conversation, and you know he does a lot of work looking at what the impact of asking certain questions in certain conversations and people's beliefs versus reality. And so I'm really interested in sort of the consequences of starting too shallow in a situation in which you can leave the conversation. A lot of research up until now has focused on like you're putting people in a room for 20 minutes and you're making them have a conversation. But in our daily lives and in, this type of setting, like at Shuffle, if people have the opportunity to leave, like when does that happen? And
Mhm.
how can you make it so that your conversation starts out engaging enough that people don't opt out? And so that's how I got here, and that's what I'm really passionate about. Like I really like thinking about how people form social connections and how people navigate social situations.
That's amazing. It sounds so cool. Like I feel that people who
Thank
study
you.
PhDs and like who got really into academia are people who are so passionate about whatever topic they do that it's amazing. It's just really really cool. Um so what is something that you will say is the craziest belief that you have heard from a person? Like just because as you said, like they can be miscalculated or they can be just completely out of touch with reality. I think you have met many people as like in your research and stuff.
So I will say that my research focuses on averages. So there
Mhm.
is a type of research that does sort of qualitative one-on-one interviews. That's not what I do. I ask people questions and I take the sort of average response.
Mhm.
So I can't say that I've gotten any like one sort of belief from one person.
Mhm.
But what I do think is really interesting is that in, the lab I'm in has done all of this work on people's expectations compared to reality in conversation. And people like so consistently underestimate how enjoyable conversations with strangers will be. And I think that's, really important to understanding why people don't seek out conversations with other people. Because if you think that it's not going to be enjoyable, then you're not going to opt into it. There's always this sort of huge gap between how enjoyable people think it's going to be and how enjoyable it actually is. So if people were taking more of these opportunities or didn't have as many of these, barriers, then people would be much more willing to talk to other people. And I think that's so interesting, especially since, we have conversations with new people all the time, but we don't learn, like we don't update this belief, and we don't have data to this effect. But what we theorize is happening is that people don't generalize it. People will think, oh, well, I just happened to have conversational chemistry with this person. But it doesn't mean that all conversations are going to be enjoyable. It just means that this one conversation with this one person was enjoyable. And I think that's really interesting, because if we could get people to sort of overcome that hump and realize that most conversations tend to be pretty enjoyable, you might see people have less of a fear of engagement with others.
Mm-hmm. That sounds interesting because it's also like how you see people, everyone in their phones instead of like talking to each other in like a cafe or in the bus or even in the airplane. Before it was very common to see people talking to each other. Now everyone is in their phones or in their TVs, and they don't really.
Yeah.
Human interaction is less common now, I will say.
And so I think what our research will tell you is that if you think of having like a train ride where you're on your phone versus a train ride where you're having a conversation, you're probably going to enjoy the conversation more. And we do have a ton of data to this effect. Now, that being said, people have, there's always an opportunity cost, right? Like there are times where it is preferable to sit on your phone, even if that's not the most enjoyable way to spend your time. Maybe you need to respond to emails. Maybe, you just want a moment to yourself to decompress. One thing that we do find is that people think that social interaction is going to be exhausting and draining. And sometimes this, whether you're an introvert or extrovert, sort of, like introverts and extroverts have sort of qualitatively different answers to this question. But it might feel, introverts might think it's more draining than extroverts, but people generally, after they have a conversation, report feeling energized. So it's not even that, sometimes you're just too tired and you want to have some time on your phone. It's just that, like, we're not always doing things that are the most enjoyable thing. And sometimes it's important to give ourselves a rest. But it is important to sort of recognize if you're sitting on your phone and you're thinking, oh, this is kind of a bad way to spend my time, you're probably going to have a better time having a conversation with someone.
That sounds amazing. That's a lot of
Yeah,
thought.
we actually,
Yeah.
one area of research that we're just getting into, so we don't have a ton of data, but what we're exploring is that people like miss opportunities to have connections with others. And so, for example, we're looking at whether people think that they can combine certain activities that are maybe not social with some dimension of sociality. So, for example, if you're commuting and you're driving home or something, does it occur to you that you could call a friend and have a conversation during that car ride? You obviously, like, maybe it does occur to you and you decide not to, but we're curious if that even like enters people's attention. And that's generalizable to any opportunity to meet someone. So, for example, maybe you go to a fitness class, and the purpose of that fitness class is to exercise. But does it occur to you to, strike up a conversation with someone? So we're trying to see if it's sort of like an attentional problem, like people are missing these opportunities where they can engage with others.
I do have a friend who calls me every time she's commuting from work to their house. She lives in the States,
Yeah.
so her commute is quite long. So she calls me
Yeah.
like the 45 minutes she has to commute. And I see now why. Like a good conversation, 45 minutes is good. But
Exactly.
I live in a small city, so it's like 10 minutes for me. So for me, it's just like, okay, 10 minutes is good. I can live without conversation. But
Yeah.
that's amazing. That's a lot of thought. I think people who go to shuffle events will have a lot of to think about how to make those 10 minutes worth it, to make connections and to make the conversation worth. We do give prompts to people so they can strike up good conversations. We do have very easy prompts like, oh, where do you want to travel next? Or how do you spend your Sunday? Or what do you do to get rid of stress? Like things like that. We do have deeper ones like, what are you grateful for? Or things like, what will your child self will be surprised that you have now? Things a little bit deeper, so people will uh, feel have deeper conversations in general. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, anything that you would like to tell them just before we leave?
No, I think all of those questions sound great. I would be curious to see if the people who get the deeper questions are more likely to sort of form a connection with that person than the people who get the less deep questions. But I think even, what do you do on a typical Sunday? That opens up a door to have a deeper conversation because whatever you say, it obviously assuming that people are in a place where they want to self-disclose, which it seems like they would be in this type of context where they're trying to meet people. But, your Sunday is going to be different than mine. It's going to be different than somebody else. And talking about that, like that's inherently personal, which is great. My advice would be, to the extent that you can, give people only one prompt. Or, maybe if they have multiple, my guess would be that people choose the shallower ones. But it could be cool to play around with giving people one prompt and sort of anchoring the conversation, either
Oh,
like
they
on the
they
deeper end
have
of the
one.
spectrum or in the middle.
They
Oh,
have just
perfect.
one,
Yeah,
one per round. So it's just randomly what they get per round.
perfect.
So we are
Yeah.
stuck with
No,
one.
I, yeah, I'd be so curious to see if the deeper ones lead to more connections or not. Um,
That will be
but
interesting to
it sounds
know.
like you guys are asking the right questions and giving people the tools to be good conversationalists.
Great. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast. I really appreciate it. This was really good. A really good conversation, let's say.
Thank you so much for having me.
And good luck with your research. I hope to read it soon.
Thanks. Good luck with everything at Shuffle. It's really exciting work.